when I saw him in that lineup.
The story of Vincent Simmons is one of the most controversial criminal cases in Louisiana's history. A man convicted of a heinous crime, sentenced to 100 years behind bars, yet for over 4 decades, he maintained his innocence. Was justice truly served, or was an innocent man imprisoned for a crime he did not commit? Tonight, we unravel the case that has divided a community for more than 40 years. Let's uncover the full story behind the world's most chilling cases. Welcome to Dark Chronicles, where shadows hide the truth. Louisiana, 1977. A small town, a brutal crime, and a man sentenced to life behind bars. But did Vincent Simmons really commit the crime, or was he a victim of a broken system? This is the story of the Vincent Simmons case, one that has sparked decades of controversy, raising questions about justice, evidence, and the truth hidden beneath the surface. It all began on May 9, 1977, in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana. Twin sisters Karen and Sharon Sanders, just 14 years old at the time, claimed they were kidnapped and assaulted by a black man they did not know. Their cousin, Keith Laborde, who was with them that night, supported their story. But what happened in those crucial hours before they went to the police? And how did Vincent Simmons become the prime suspect? The sisters told investigators that they were driving around with their cousin when a man flagged them down on the side of the road. According to their account, he forced them into the car at gunpoint, drove to a remote location, and committed the crime before letting them go. With no physical evidence and no clear suspect, police were under pressure to find anyone to answer for the crime. Just 2 weeks later, Vincent Simmons, a 25-year-old black man, was arrested. But here's the shocking part. He didn't match the original description given by the victims. Simmons was never placed in a lineup. Instead, police simply brought him into an interrogation room where the sisters identified him on the spot. Within 24 hours, he was charged. No alibi was recorded. No physical evidence was collected. No forensic analysis was done. Yet, within 2 months, Vincent Simmons was on trial for his life. The trial was swift, too swift. His public defender had only 3 weeks to prepare. During the proceedings, the jury, all white, heard the testimony of Karen and Sharon Sanders. They vividly described their traumatic experience, stating without hesitation that Simmons was the man who attacked them. The prosecution leaned heavily on their testimony. There was no DNA evidence, no fingerprints, no witnesses other than the 3 victims. But what about Vincent Simmons? He pleaded not guilty, claiming he had never seen these girls before in his life. In his own words, "I don't know these people. I had nothing to do with this." Despite his defense, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before delivering their verdict. Guilty on all charges. The sentence? 100 years in Angola prison. A case closed? Not quite. Over the years, inconsistencies in the case began to surface. Evidence that could have changed everything was discovered. Evidence that was never shown to the defense, the jury, or the public. But could this evidence be enough to set Vincent Simmons free? For years, Vincent Simmons sat in Angola prison, maintaining his innocence. But outside those prison walls, doubts about his conviction began to grow. Lawyers, journalists, and activists started digging deeper into the case. What they found was disturbing. Police reports, medical records, and key testimonies that had never been properly examined in court. Let's start with the police investigation. The original incident report filed by the victims had glaring issues. When Karen and Sharon Sanders first spoke with investigators, they described their attacker as a black man with a large afro and a gap in his teeth. But here's the problem. Vincent Simmons didn't have an afro, his hair was short, and he didn't have a gap in his teeth. Then there was the medical evidence, or rather, the lack of it. A doctor examined the twins after the alleged assault. His findings? no physical signs that either girl had been harmed in the way they described. In fact, he explicitly wrote in his report that there was no medical proof of an assault. Yet, none of this information was presented in court. But it didn't stop there. Years later, in a shocking twist, Simmons and his legal team discovered a secret document buried in the case files. This document was a police lineup record. It showed that there was an actual lineup conducted, something the authorities had always denied. The document proved that the twins originally couldn't identify their attacker, but instead of considering the possibility that Simmons was innocent, detectives simply ignored it. So, why was Vincent Simmons still in prison? Because of one thing: the legal system's unwillingness to admit mistakes. For years, Simmons fought for a new trial. Each time, his requests were denied. Prosecutors argued that despite the inconsistencies, the testimony of Karen and Sharon Sanders was enough to convict him. But was it really? In a later interview, Keith Laborde, the twins' cousin, gave conflicting statements about what happened that night. His timeline of events didn't match the girls' original testimony. Even more suspicious, Keith had a history of violent behavior. Some theories suggest that he might have been involved in the crime, and that Simmons was a convenient scapegoat. Could it be that the real attacker was never brought to justice? As the years passed, the case continued to gain attention. True crime investigators, legal experts, and activists started pushing for Simmons' release. But the state of Louisiana refused to reopen the case. For Vincent Simmons, it was a never-ending nightmare, but change was coming. By the early 2000s, Vincent Simmons had spent more than 2 decades behind bars. His story had begun to attract national attention, with investigative journalists and legal advocates digging deeper into the case. The evidence was mounting. Simmons' conviction was built on shaky ground. One of the biggest bombshells came when previously unseen documents surfaced. These included the prosecution's own case files, files that had been hidden from the defense during the original trial. What did these documents reveal? First, they showed that detectives had taken multiple statements from the Sanders twins and Keith Laborde, but their stories changed over time. One early report indicated that Karen and Sharon originally failed to identify Simmons as their attacker, but by the time of the trial, their statements had shifted. Suddenly, they were certain that he was the man responsible. What caused this change? Was it memory or something else? Then there was the lineup issue. Simmons had long insisted that the police lineup was staged, that officers had singled him out. Now, official records supported his claim. Detectives allegedly told the twins which suspect to pick. In other words, the lineup wasn't about finding the truth, it was about securing a conviction. But if these documents were so powerful, why didn't they lead to a new trial? Because Louisiana's legal system made it almost impossible for wrongfully convicted prisoners to challenge their cases. Despite multiple appeals, courts repeatedly refused to reopen Simmons' case. By now, public interest was at an all-time high. Investigative journalists produced documentaries and news specials questioning the conviction. Legal experts pointed to racial bias and prosecutorial misconduct. Activists and supporters of Simmons started organizing petitions and campaigns. The case became a symbol of injustice. But would it be enough to set him free? For Vincent Simmons, the fight for justice wasn't just about himself. It was about shining a light on the flaws in the system, a system that had failed him for decades. And finally, after years of struggle, a major breakthrough was on the horizon. The turning point came in 2022. After 44 years behind bars, Vincent Simmons was granted a hearing to review his case. This was something he had fought for since the day of his conviction. The courtroom was filled with reporters, legal analysts, and supporters who had followed his story for decades. This time, Simmons wasn't the one on trial. The justice system was. his attorneys presented the undisclosed evidence that had been buried for years. They argued that the case was built on false testimony, racial bias, and a deeply flawed police investigation. Then came the most explosive moment. The judge himself acknowledged that Simmons had never received a fair trial. In his ruling, he vacated the conviction. Just like that, after more than 4 decades in prison, Vincent Simmons was no longer a convicted man. But would he be declared innocent? Under Louisiana law, having a conviction vacated does not mean exoneration. The state had to decide whether to retry him or drop the charges altogether. With no DNA evidence, no physical proof, and a case that had been torn apart in court, prosecutors had only one option. They dismissed all charges against Simmons. After 44 years, Vincent Simmons walked out of Angola prison, a free man. But freedom came with a price. Simmons was now 70 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in prison for a crime he always said he didn't commit. And despite having his conviction overturned, he was never compensated for the time he lost. So what does this case tell us? Was justice finally served? Or did the system simply try to correct a mistake too late? Even today, the Sanders twins stand by their story. They insist that Simmons was guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence suggesting otherwise. Meanwhile, Simmons has spoken out about his experience. He has advocated for criminal justice reform, using his story to highlight the dangers of wrongful convictions. But the scars of his past remain. This case raises uncomfortable questions about the American justice system, about how easily someone can be tried, convicted, and forgotten. How many more Vincent Simmons are still behind bars, waiting for someone to listen? And with that, the case of Vincent Simmons comes to a close. Or does it? Even though Vincent Simmons was now a free man, his story was far from over. When he stepped out of Angola prison, reporters swarmed him with questions. Do you feel justice has been served? What will you do now? Do you have any resentment toward the system? Simmons remained calm. He had spent decades preparing for this moment. His response? I just want to live. Beat for emotional impact. But the world had changed. He had been locked up since 1977. Now in 2022, he was stepping into a society dominated by technology, social media, and a legal system that still had many of the same flaws that put him away. One of the first things Simmons did was visit the places he had only seen in his memories, his old neighborhood, the streets where he once walked freely. But there was a painful reality waiting for him. Most of the people he knew were gone. Friends had moved on, family members had passed away, and the justice system that took his life from him had no intention of giving him anything back. Unlike some exonerated individuals, Simmons was not automatically entitled to compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. In Louisiana, a person must prove their innocence beyond any doubt to receive restitution. And remember, the state never declared him innocent. They simply vacated his conviction and dropped the charges. That meant Simmons was released with nothing, no money, no resources, no official recognition of the injustice done to him. He had to start from scratch. So what does a man do after losing nearly 45 years of his life? For Simmons, the answer was simple. He told his story. He spoke at events. He shared his experience in interviews. He used his voice to fight for others still trapped in the system. But the trauma of what he endured never truly left him. Years of isolation, years of being called a criminal, years of fighting for a justice system that only seemed to listen when it was too late. And even as a free man, his record was never wiped clean. For some, he would always be associated with the accusations that put him in prison. So where does Vincent Simmons' story end? Or more importantly, does it ever truly end? For Vincent Simmons, freedom was just the beginning. He had walked out of Angola a free man, but the shadow of his wrongful conviction still loomed over him. There were still doubts, still whispers, still people who refused to believe in his innocence. even though the case against him had been exposed as deeply flawed. In the years that followed, Simmons became a symbol, a name that people invoked when talking about injustice, corruption, and the failures of the American legal system. But Vincent Simmons was more than a symbol. He was a man trying to reclaim his life, a life that had been taken from him. He started speaking at events, meeting with legal advocacy groups, and sharing his experiences with young people who were at risk of falling into the system. His story became part of a larger conversation about wrongful convictions. And then came the documentaries, the books, and the investigative reports, all peeling back the layers of a case that never should have resulted in a conviction in the first place. The public opinion had shifted. In the late 1970s, he had been seen as a dangerous criminal. Now, he was seen as a man who had suffered one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Louisiana's history. But that didn't mean everyone accepted his innocence. There were still people who clung to the original narrative, who refused to acknowledge the evidence that had been uncovered. Some still believed the original accusations. Some still defended the legal system that had failed him. And some simply didn't care. Because when a person spends decades behind bars, the world keeps moving without them. For Vincent Simmons, the reality was harsh. He was free, but he had no job history, no savings, and no safety net. The state that had imprisoned him had no obligation to help him rebuild his life. And so he had to do it on his own. But the most haunting part, even as he tried to move forward, he still had questions. Questions about the case, questions about the people involved, questions about why justice had taken so long. And one question above all others that still lingered in the minds of many: would anyone ever be held accountable for what happened to Vincent Simmons? Vincent Simmons had spent over 40 years behind bars for a crime that many now believed he did not commit. He had fought for his freedom. He had exposed the cracks in the justice system. He had survived one of the most notorious wrongful convictions in Louisiana's history. But there was one thing he never got: accountability. No prosecutor was ever punished for withholding evidence. No detective faced consequences for coercing statements. No judge admitted that the trial had been an absolute failure of justice. And the people who had put him in that cell, they walked free. This is the harsh reality of wrongful convictions. For many, an overturned conviction is the end of the story. For the system, it is a closed chapter, a mistake that's quietly swept away. But for people like Vincent Simmons, the fight never truly ends, because even after freedom, there are wounds that never fully heal. For the rest of his life, Simmons spoke about justice reform, about the dangers of a deeply flawed legal system, about the countless others who were still trapped inside. He became a symbol, but he was still a man who had lost everything, a man who could never get those lost decades back. And in the end, that's the true tragedy of the Vincent Simmons case. It wasn't just about one wrongful conviction. It was about a system that made it so easy to destroy a life and so difficult to admit when it was wrong. Even today, his story remains a powerful warning, because if it could happen to Vincent Simmons, it could happen to anyone. So what happens now? Vincent Simmons is free. His conviction was overturned, but the scars remain. The state of Louisiana never apologized. There was no compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. No one was ever held accountable for the years stolen from him. But Vincent never stopped fighting. In interviews, he spoke about forgiveness, but never forgetting. He wanted people to understand the truth, not just about his case, but about the countless others still locked away, waiting for justice. And that brings us to the bigger question. How many more Vincent Simmons are out there? How many people are sitting in cells right now, convicted on flimsy evidence, with lost files and hidden police reports, with witnesses pressured to lie, with a system that just wants to move on instead of admitting its mistakes? The case of Vincent Simmons is a warning, because wrongful convictions don't just destroy one person's life. They destroy families, they destroy communities, they destroy faith in the system. And if justice means anything, it has to mean more than just words. It has to mean action. Because next time, it could be you. And that concludes today's deep dive into the case of Vincent Simmons. What do you think? Was justice truly served, or was this another case of a broken system failing the innocent? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this case compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another mystery from Dark Chronicles.